It is our thoughts, whether it be anxiety or depression, whether it be mild or moderate. The fact is that depression and anxiety reside in our thinking. So if our thoughts are feeding anxiety, depression, we will grow in that struggle. It is very important to learn how to retrain the mind to really stop the process of feeding and then to move towards how we starve and neutralize those habits.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode as well as free training on creativity over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have on the show Dr. Joe Luciani. Dr. Joe Luciani has been a practicing clinical psychologist for more than 40 years. He's the internationally best-selling author of the self-coaching series of books, now published in 10 languages. His latest book is called Unlearning Anxiety and Depression, the 4-step self-coaching program to reclaim your life. And it's my great pleasure to have Joe with us today. So welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be with you.
So share with us all what's happening in your world at the moment.
Well, what's happening in my world is happening in the world, and that's dealing with this virus. And I really think that, it's starting to cause some rumbling in terms of, the polar opposites, stay conservative, open up. So we're going through kind of a debate over here in the States as to how we proceed. So there's a bit of psychological going back and forth. So it's not so easy right now for anyone, and certainly those that have lost and those that are just really dealing with anxiety and depression, it becomes so exacerbated by all of this. So as far as my world, I'm dealing with a lot of people calling up for appointments, remote appointments. I'm trying to do as many articles as I can to try to help people. So I'm pretty busy right now.
It's interesting, as we've been seeing all this start to unfold in different countries. I've got a friend over in Italy, and they were a couple of weeks ahead of where we were. I'm in the UK, obviously you're in the States. And it was interesting having conversations with them because it almost felt like they were telling us our future the whole time. Mm-hmm. And I remember having a conversation with her probably a couple of weeks as we were kind of getting into COVID-19 really hitting in the UK in a big way. And at this point, everyone was, they were doing, they were clapping for carers, for the first responders. They were doing a lot of Zoom kind of meetups and things. And she said to me, you are where we were 4 weeks ago. Said, but then we went into this other stage where everything started getting really quiet, and people started mentally kind of going into their caves as well. And she said, it's almost felt like we had the physical health crisis that kind of really hit first. And then as the economic crisis started to hit, then we're getting this mental health tsunami that's kind of following kind of on behind as well. So what are you seeing? I mean, obviously you can study this in terms of, trauma, how things like unemployment affect anxiety, depression, mental health as well. What are you starting to see as we're recording this at the moment?
Well, one of the things that I'm seeing that kind of really disturbs me is, I guess I would call it tolerance. It's like a rubber band, an elastic band that has been stretched, and it feels like it's about to snap. And I think by and large, I would say here in the States, we've been pretty good, which isn't always the case, but I think as a society, we've been pretty good. But now I'm beginning to see the tolerance beginning to wane. And it's almost like, when you hold your head underwater or a beach ball underwater, that ball just wants to just burst through the surface. So I'm a little bit worried that we might start seeing some rumblings in terms of just the intolerance now that's beginning to grow. So we really are at the crossroads right now, opening up gradually in different states and seeing what happens. But there are those, of course, that that are wild cards. You can't predict their behavior, and they have a hard time following rules. So we shall see. We are still evolving, and that's where I see things. Those with anxiety and depression, that's more or less a cumulative thing. I see that growing in intensity. I see more anxiety than depression, but I think more depression is going to come. I just finished an article on what I call the post-traumatic effects of COVID-19. And I think even after this has gone down to really a bearable zero new patient kind of situation, I think there's going to be, for a long time, you'll be in a store and someone will sneeze and you're going to have this almost post-traumatic response. Your emotions will come back. If someone bumps you in a line, you're going to just be hypertensive on less than a conscious level. So I think there'll be lingering post-traumatic effects as well as the traumatic effects we're going through right now.
And in your book, you kind of take an interesting perspective on anxiety and depression, and you talk about anxiety and depression as being a habit. So, which is something I'd never kind of really thought about so much. You think about it's kind of good habits, bad habits, some habits you're trying to improve upon, some habits maybe you're trying to get rid of as well. So I guess, well, first of all, tell me where you came to this take on anxiety and depression being something that's kind of related to habits.
Well, I know it sounds heretical to treat anxiety and depression as habits, but part of the problem is that traditionally the medical model has kind of inculcated our minds with the fact that these are mental illnesses. And with an illness, of course, you're a victim. You're in the back seat and the illness is driving. Anxiety and depression, as I see it, are the end result. And let me just preface it by saying it begins with insecurity. We all have insecurity. No one grows up in a perfect world. And insecurity, in order to compensate for our natural inherent vulnerabilities, we develop strategies of control. We worry, we anticipate, we avoid. We have all of these strategies that keep us pretty well balanced. But it's the control juggle that eventually begins to erode, and that's where we start getting into stress. And stress is what changes chemistry. And that's really what we need to understand. Stress changes chemistry. The balance that we have in our brain, those neurotransmitters that keep us emotionally balanced, they become like a bucket with holes in the bottom. They begin to drip out, drip by drip. As you become depleted, you become susceptible to anxiety, depression. So what I have come up with in my self-coaching is that if we allow our thoughts to contribute to the habits of anxiety and depression, we are adding to the stress, we are continuing the depletion process. So it is our thoughts, whether it be anxiety or depression, whether it be mild or moderate. The fact is that depression and anxiety reside in our thinking. So if our thoughts are feeding anxiety, depression, we will grow in that struggle. It is very important to learn how to retrain the mind to really stop the process of feeding and then to move towards how we starve and neutralize those habits.
So if I was an alien coming to Earth for the first time and I didn't know what anxiety, being anxious or being depressed was, what would I have to do? What would be a really good way to very quickly become anxious and depressed? So it's like we can start to think about, well, what might the opposite of that look like?
Well, with anxiety, of course, the quintessential aspect of anxiety is the what ifing, that anticipatory kind of looking into the future and trying to feel safe by anticipating what's coming around the corner before it arrives. So with anxiety, we are distrusting our ability to handle what comes around the corner. And with that distrust, of course, we are left with trying to anticipate to protect ourselves. So, and I should preface it by saying not all anticipation, of course, is neurotic or negative. We wear seatbelts and take vitamins. That's good control. But it's the neurotic control, the incessant worrying, what if, what if, what if? We don't worry about things going right. We worry about things going wrong. And it's the worrying that I feel is the quintessential aspect of anxiety and depression. Depression has more of a retrograde feel. We look back over past guilts and shames and things that bother us. But nevertheless, we're always leaving the present. And that's the point. The point is, if you really want to teach our alien friend how to avoid anxiety and depression, we try to strive to become more present, not in the future, not in the past. And in the present is our best chance to really grapple with thoughts then that support anxiety and depression. When you look at anxious thoughts, you'll always be living somewhere in an anticipatory future. And with depression and anxiety, it's absolutely critical to be rooted in the present and to realize that that is your single best chance of developing an objective view of your world.
And it feels like a lot of things that where it's kind of social media, the news, they kind of almost like doing everything to kind of stop us being in that present place and being kind of present with ourselves and our thoughts.
Yeah, we can't, obviously no one could, I don't care if you're sitting on a mountaintop meditating in the Himalayas, you can't do it 24/7. So we try to just train ourselves to be as present as possible, especially when you feel stress or struggle, to try to realize where your mind is at that point, to bring yourself back to the present. So if you, Eckhart Tolle, for example, it says that if you are truly present, it's impossible to be anxious or depressed. And I totally agree with that, because to be anxious or depressed, again, you leave the present and you go into the future or the past. So being present does require practice, as you would an instrument. The more you practice it, the more you begin to realize that you do have a choice with your thoughts. And that's a fundamental concept in my Unlearning book, is that we need to become first critical observers. We need to dispassionately, almost like a court stenographer, we need to start looking at our thoughts without getting involved and making a separation between facts and emotional fictions. Once we make that separation, then we're in a position of choice. Do I allow these fictions to rule my reality, or do I insist on the facts? So the very first, I call it mind talk. The very first step is to separate facts from emotional fictions.
And what's going in terms of from a physiological perspective, what's kind of going on when people are kind of going into those into that levels of anxiety or depression? I remember reading years ago, I think it was in the US military, where they looked at regular army folks and the soldiers in the army, and they noticed when they put them into high stress environments, I think it was their cortisol levels would spike. I think I'm not sure if that's the right chemical.
That is,
the
yes.
cortisol levels would spike. But then they looked at people that worked in the special forces, and a strange kind of thing happened to them, where when they went into those, what everyone else would class as kind of high stress, and even regular soldiers would class as high stress environments, they got calmer, they got more present, more in the moment. What's going on then from a physiological perspective when that happens?
Well, I would say that phenomenon really depends on a couple of things. One's innate physiology. I mean, there are thrill seekers and those that do calm down with high stress. But I think that's more of an innate capacity. I think by and large, I think the majority of people are more or less just the opposite, where when there is a stressful challenge, our fight, you've probably heard of fight flight. They've added another called flight, freeze, fight. And I've added a fourth, which is fester. So it's fight, flight, freeze, or fester. The festering part is the mental part. And I like to throw that in there, because when you start to imagine saber-toothed tigers coming out of the jungles, your body reacts as if that's true. It doesn't differentiate. So your mind now is throwing, as you say, cortisol, adrenaline, various stress hormones into the body. Your limbic system, that's the primitive system in your body, is now taking over. It is more or less going away from cognitive thinking and putting you in a fight, flight, freeze, or fester mode, and it's protecting you. So those stress chemicals come about because that is our species inheritance. If it wasn't for that, we probably wouldn't be here today. But what is important is the festering part. You see, as I said, if you imagine danger in safe places, you will act as if that danger is in front of you. Your body doesn't know the difference. That's why it's so important to not allow the mind to more or less leave the present into a worrisome future or past. So the more that we calm ourselves down, get away from the sympathetic, or that's the reactive body, the primitive body and mind, and put ourselves into a parasympathetic, which is the relaxed psyche, the relaxed brain, that's where we have a chance to now observe those thoughts and say, wait a second, what am I getting myself worked up at? And facts versus fictions. See, what happens oftentimes is we tend to muddle the difference and we become our own stress.
And in your book, you take us through these kind of 4 steps to, you call unlearning anxiety, depression, like something that we've developed as and this kind of process unlearning. Can you take us just as an overview of those kind of 4 steps as you walk people through it?
Yeah, and I think the first concept, unlearning, implies, of course, that anxiety and depression have been learned. These are long-standing habits, and a habit is really a habit loop within the brain. We're actually talking brain structure. So that's why it's very resistant to change, and that's why people that really struggle with anxiety and depression have to do what I call practice, 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 just like an instrument. And you need a format for that. And I have a 4-step program called Mind Talk. And you must practice this on a daily basis. There is no free lunch. For example, step 1, as I just explained, is separating facts from emotional fictions. So you become a critical observer of your own thinking. You make that separation, facts, fictions, and then you take it to the second step, stopping insecurity-driven thinking. I have one technique called the ABC technique. We can't stop a nefarious thought from percolating up into our mind. That's the A thought. And then we have a B thought. Let's say the A thought is, oh, what if I catch this virus? Well, the B thought is, yeah, then what will I do? And then I'll give it to my family, and then this will happen. So we may not be able to control the first thought from percolating up from the unconscious, but we darn well can get into the second, third, fourth, and fifth thought and put a stop to that. So the ABC technique is really trying to take conscious control over the progression of insecurity-driven thinking. One other technique in step 2 would be active ignoring. My son lived in Manhattan, and every time I'd go there, I'd say, how do you stand the traffic noise, the sirens, the sounds? How do you sleep? And he looked at me and he said, what noise? and I thought he was kind of kidding, but I thought about it and I realized that his brain had learned and trained itself to ignore that noise, the cacophony of noise from the street. And I said to myself, well, why can't we train the brain to ignore the noise of negative, insecurity-driven thinking? And that's precisely what we can do. We can actually learn to actively ignore, to turn away from the traffic noises and the noise in our own brains, the noise of insecurity-driven, just nefarious, neurotic thoughts. And once you learn that you can actually, it can be there, like standing next to a stream. The stream is flowing right there, but you don't have to be in the stream. You can step out of it and actively ignore it, and eventually start training the brain on just a neuron level to really begin to develop a new habit. And then another aspect of step 2 would be envisioning. We know about how just imagining certain pleasant things, like just being on a beach or relaxing, these things put us into a calmer mode, and they help us detach from being attached to those negative thoughts, those neurotic insecurity thoughts. And there are many ways to get into the parasympathetic, relaxed mind and body. But it's important to realize that you must stop the runaway train of insecurity-driven thinking if you expect to really retrain the brain and retrain your life. And the third step is called responsive living. If I get in my car and I say to myself, what if a deer runs in front of my car? Should I hit the brake? Should I turn the wheel? Now that's insecurity or neurotic thinking, because we're anticipating a deer that hasn't occurred. So we're there in the future. And the bottom line with responsive living is learning that anxiety, depression are based on self-distrust. We've learned to distrust ourselves, and therefore we have to anticipate, we have to worry. With self-trust, as you train yourself to develop self-trust, you say to yourself, well, if a deer ever runs in front of my car, I'll just handle it. And you have that profound trust in your own instincts, your own survivability, that you will handle life as it unfolds. And that frees you up from all that anticipatory stuff, all that anxiety, because now with trust, you know that you'll handle things. You've handled thousands and thousands of problems in the past. What makes you think you won't handle the next one spontaneously? We are survival machines. We have that apparatus, but you have to trust it to really put it into play. And the fourth step in Mind Talk is motivation. I have found working with especially depressed patients that there needs to be a degree of optimism. There needs to be a degree of hope. You need to convince people that they can. And oftentimes in depressed patients, they come into the office saying, I can't. And the first word I have them lose is that word can't, because feelings aren't facts. You might feel you can't, but you can't treat that as if it's factual. So the motivation to really believe and develop a sense of hope and optimism is based on objective data, on reframing our thoughts and our cognitive minds, but also reshaping the neuroplastic brain. So we do all this through practice. We're actually reshaping the brain. We're neutralizing old bad insecurity-driven habits, and we're replacing those habits with more adaptive functioning. So that's basically the 4 steps.
And talking about adaptability, can you tell us about a time when you worked on something, you were doing something, and you can put a lot of time and effort into it, and it didn't work out like you'd hoped, but more importantly, what was the lesson that you took from that experience?
Well, let me answer that from just a profound experience I had, which is kind of answering your question. When I was in high school, I thought I had I just thought I wasn't very smart. Let's put it that way. I couldn't spell, and I therefore didn't hand in papers. I kept drifting away towards sports and things like that. When I went to my senior year, I went to the guidance counselor with my mother to ask what my mother wanted to know what college he would recommend. He looked at her, and then he looked at me, and he looked back at her, and he said, "Don't waste your money." That was so pivotal in my life. To me, I felt such a failure. So I went out and I started loading trucks for a living after my high school career. And if it wasn't for sports, which inadvertently got me into college, I began to realize, though, over time, just through tenacity, that my skills started to develop, and this inability to spell and express myself verbally, not verbally so much as in the written word, that started to get better. And at first I thought it was just a sham, that I was just hiding the real truth and everybody would find out how dumb I was. But as my grades started to get better, as I started to get more proficient in writing, and my whole experience of college, I began to realize that maybe the truth was that I had miscalculated. So all those years I had a habit of seeing myself one way, which wasn't the realistic way, but I was burying myself with self-doubt. So once I began to trust the truth of my life, that's when everything turned around. My college and graduate career was nothing I could have ever dreamt of. The fact that I've become an author, and this is my 7th book, that would have been beyond. I would have thought you were on drugs if you told me that could happen. So from that really dismal place of feeling absolutely dumb, to the place where I have this trust now in my God-given ability to express myself and help people. It's been quite a life-changing event, that one don't waste your money time.
And was part of that as well, you mentioned the sports side, that you had something that you were able to kind of develop a level of mastery at, and that kind of, in terms
Yes.
of a growth mindset, knowing that something doesn't have to be the way it is, something can be improved, can be changed. Did that lend itself to then the academic side?
Well, I was a pole vaulter in college, and pole vaulting is a very demanding mental. I mean, it's physical, of course, but if your mind isn't totally present, it can't happen. But that was very helpful in keeping me focused. Through the pole vaulting, I really learned that I had to control my mind. once I got into school, of course, I couldn't let the doubts drift in, and the fears and the doubts, fears and negatives. So I had that ability to get really hyper focused on what I needed to do. And I'd say that kind of training, later on in life, I began to run marathons, and you can imagine the kind of mental tenacity that takes. So throughout my whole life, I've found that the more one applies oneself with a tenacious desire, with the goal in sight, it's always a matter of, you know, that first step leading to the 26 miles. You can do just about anything if you break it down incrementally and believe in every step you take. If you look too far ahead, you may stumble. So I'm a firm believer in taking life as it unfolds, handling that to the best of your ability. As I tell my patients, you can't do better than your best. So give it your best, be satisfied, and be motivated by that encouragement that you give yourself to take the second and third and fourth step.
Now, as we start to finish up here, some quite final kind of quick fire questions for you as well. Do you have you mentioned the writing being very important to you as well, but do you have an online resource or a tool or a mobile app that you find very useful for the work that you do?
You know what? I don't. I'm an old dinosaur. For me, it's stick-em notes and just really just embracing what my patients tell me, recording that and mulling over just copious notes until insight occurs, and it always does over time. So I'm not as proficient as my son or daughter might be, but I'm more or less a paper and pencil guy.
And do you find when you're in that process of just taking in lots of research, lots of information, the stuff that's coming in from you working with your clients as well, before you start that process of writing, do you have to change your environment, your physical environment, or just kind of like go and do something else for a while? Or do you find that you're just constantly adding, constantly writing?
Well, that's a very nice point, because basically I turn to nature. Sometimes I just need to, in a meditative sense, not be always thinking, because it's a very cognitive world I live in, always trying to figure out the why. Why is that person suffering? Why can't I get at that problem? For me, then I'll go outside either for a jog or just to be around nature and trees and grass, and not to really think, but to restore. One thing I have found, and it has served me all my life, is that it will find you. My favorite adage is a Zen adage, and it's, when the pupil is ready, the teacher appears. I absolutely live by that adage. And sometimes I realize I just have to be patient. It does come. If you believe in yourself, if you do your homework, if you're tenacious enough, it will find you. And I've always benefited from that adage.
And what about if you were to recommend one book to our listeners, and also one album or one record? What would those be?
The book would be Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. Siddhartha is kind of the fictional Buddha, and he's looking for enlightenment, and he goes off and he tries to make some money, and the finances seem to be a way that he's going to find it. Then he goes off and lives this ascetic life of just being deprived of it, and he goes through his life just trying all these things externally, trying to find his meaning. Eventually he does find it, but he finds it from a river captain, a person on the side of a river, who more or less instructs him to observe and be with the river. It's more or less a meditative book, but basically what it says is that learn everything you can, put it all together, but then ultimately turn within for that ultimate answer. So Siddhartha would be my all-time favorite book, especially for young people. I always recommend that. It's a young person's journey, but they need to know that there's more to it than just looking for finances or immediate career goals. There's a lot more to life than that. As for a record, I would have to go with Louis Armstrong, What a Wonderful World. I'm a profound optimist. I think there is no greater song of encouragement and beauty than Louis Armstrong with that big smile singing What a Wonderful World.
So Joe, I want you to imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you've got all the tools of your trade, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you and you know no one. What would you do? How would you restart things?
That's kind of easy. I would start by, since I have all the tools, I would start by putting pen to paper. I think that what I have to offer is something that I feel very thankful for, and I think that the thing that keeps me alive is the fact that I know that there are many, many people who tell me how they've progressed and how much better they're feeling. I would want to start that writing process all over again and reaching as many people as I can from all over the world. And I've had that luxury. I mean, I've had people through the internet contacting me, asking for advice from the entire world. And it's so gratifying. So for me, waking up that morning, it would be pen to paper and getting it out there.
And talking about reaching out, if someone wants to, after listening to this, if they want to reach out to you, where's the best place for them to go to learn more about you and your writing? And where should they go to get a copy of the new book, Unlearning Anxiety and Depression?
My website is www.selfcoaching.net, N-E-T. And there's videos and there's all kinds of stuff and articles, and you get to know me a little bit in my unlearning process. And the book's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, various bookstores. So it's really just been released I think it's been 2 weeks. So I have a lot of expectations. I think this is the culmination of over 40 years of my piecing together this program. So I'm very happy with it.
Well, Dr. Joe Luciani, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing with us all about your creative life.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.